Next up, we're joined by my old friend, Andrew Altschul. Andrew is the author of 3 novels, The Gringa, Deus Ex Machina, and Lady Lazarus, and an O. Henry Prize-winning short story writer. He's a former Wallace Stegner Fellow and Jones Lecturer at Stanford. He's received fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center, the U-Cross Foundation, and the Fundación Valparaíso. He's the Director of Creative Writing at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sugi. It's good to see you, and nice to meet you, Whitney.
Nice to meet you too. Always glad to have somebody from Colorado on. I think, Colorado State is in what conference now? I was just upset when Colorado left for the Pac-12.
Yeah, you're asking the wrong guy. My father's very angry at me that I don't follow CSU sports, but
The Rams?
The Rams, I know that much. Yeah.
Okay. So we've just been talking to Scott Anderson about not the Rams or any college football, but about the CIA, which overseas might be best known for its behind-the-scenes attempts to influence the politics of other countries. In your book, an American activist becomes involved with Peruvian militants and then ends up in jail. The book takes some inspiration from the case of Lori Berenson, who spent 20 years in prison in Peru after involvement with the Tupac Amaru. In your book, years later, a journalist comes to try to learn the truth about your character, Leonora Gelb. But then that seems to be a kind of impossibility, and he struggles. Why did you decide to frame the story that way?
Sure. Well, so I lived in Peru for a couple of years in the late 1990s, and I've gone back many times since, spent a lot of time there. When I was living there, it was about 2.5 years after Lori Berenson had been arrested and tried and convicted and incarcerated in a military prison. And even at that time, the case was still very much in the news. Every time there would be a new motion by one of her lawyers, or some kind of visit to Lima by Jesse Jackson, or a member of the Clinton administration trying to plead for leniency in her case, she would come back into the news, and the press would always dredge up the same footage and the same old photographs of this woman who had, at a press conference in Lima after her arrest, had basically been shouting at the cameras, at the reporters, about the need for revolution in Peru and the oppression and misdeeds of the government. And she came off as very angry, and really, to a lot of regular Peruvians, she really fit the story that the Peruvian government had disseminated, that she was this violent foreign terrorist mastermind. And so even years later, that same footage would always be run. And the people that I spent time with in Peru, it didn't matter whether they were left-wing or right-wing, old or young, whether they had been sympathetic to the government or sympathetic to the revolutionaries during the dirty war of the 80s and early 90s. Almost everybody reacted to her the same way, with a kind of vitriol, a kind of resentment and hatred that really stunned me at the time. I mean, I was in my late 20s. I considered myself a reasonably politically aware person, but I just couldn't quite understand why this, late 20s American woman, very, very kind of petite, unthreatening looking physical person, would inspire this kind of loathing from everybody around me. So the story interested me for a long time before I started writing the novel. And one of the things that interested me most was the fact that the stories that both the government and Berenson herself told about what really happened leading up to her arrest and trial, I found both of them completely impossible to believe. The government was painting the picture of this soldier of fortune who had come down and was going to foment revolution and was stockpiling weapons and was essentially like, a Terminator type assassin who wanted to overthrow the Peruvian government and destroy Peruvian society. And on the other hand, you had Berenson, who had been renting a house in a wealthy suburb of Lima, in which about 12 or 13 members of the Tupac Amaru group had been living, claiming that she had no idea who was living in the house. She had no idea that they were involved with some kind of violent revolutionary group. She had no idea that they may have been planning some kind of violent action against the government. And that, to me, rang as equally implausible as the government's story. And so obviously somewhere in between those two wildly polar opposite stories lay the truth of what had happened. And in 15 or 20 years of journalism about the case, nobody has really ever gotten to the bottom of it. I've never read anything where I've said, oh, okay, this starts to sound more like what might have been happening in that house for the 9 or 10 months that she was living there. And I eventually just decided that I was going to have to kind of write a fictional version of it to try to figure out for myself what might be plausible, what might explain some of the psychologies, both hers and the Peruvian people and how they reacted to her.
And so you chose to write about this from the point of view of an American individual, talking about this kind of earnest do-gooding, hubris, and innocence. And then the Peruvian characters in your novel initially react to Leonora Gelb, the activist who the character you've created, in a certain way, partly because of how American institutions have behaved in other countries. You're talking about the story that the Peruvian government has disseminated. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between that individual character and then the trope of the American abroad, which is sort of part of literature for so long, and then how this connects to this long history of American interference in the politics of other countries?
Sure, I can talk to all of that. I'll try to keep it brief, but you're right. There is a long tradition in American fiction of the American abroad. I mean, it starts with Twain, who wrote very satirically about Americans abroad, but starting with Hemingway and really right up through the 20th century, early 21st century, the tradition has been much more earnest, right? I mean, these stories are largely about Americans kind of, let's say, finding themselves or going on some kind of emotional journey. I mean, if you take something like The Sun Also Rises as the kind of paradigmatic 20th century expat novel. And it's a beautiful, wonderful novel. At the same time, in that novel, we're very much centered on the perspective of Jake Barnes, the American expat. We get virtually no access to the lives or experiences or perspectives of the French or of the Spanish, the two countries in which the novel is set. No real sense of the histories of those people or how they might have felt about all these fabulously wealthy Americans just kind of frittering away their days in their midst. And that has always struck me as a very odd, really kind of American-centric idea of the world and how it reacts to us.
I'm going to say, you mentioned before that press conference, and there are all of these images of Lori Berenson, and then these ways in which she appears in history, and then you kind of filling in the gaps there. And there's this great scene early in your book where we see Leo, as she's sometimes called in the book, Leo, at a press conference. And I was wondering if you'd read a little bit from that part for us.
Sure. And like you said, this is from the prologue to the book, so there's not really anything to set up except to say that a page or two earlier, it's kind of become obvious to the reader that there's a very present narrative voice in the story. There's an I who is narrating to the reader, and that their opinions or their perspective is maybe coloring the way that the story is being told. The 1998 press conference was the first time most Peruvians had seen Leonora Gelb, 8 hectic minutes in which her fate was all but sealed. Raw-eyed and hoarse, she marched into the room without an introduction, turning upon the reporters her battered, vengeful gaze. The real danger to Peruvians is not the Cuarta Filosofia, it's their own government. The worst violence in this country is state violence. Ask the campesinos whose land was stolen, whose children are dying. Ask the people whose brothers and husbands have disappeared. It was a Tuesday morning, the ragged end of a restive, clammy winter. 3 days earlier, the house she was renting in the leafy Pueblo Libres neighborhood had been sacked by special forces, ravaged, its windows blown out, its white walls strafed. They dragged the bodies of 6 militants from that house, flaunted them to reporters while the president walked through the wreckage and shook soldiers' hands. Now she stood surrounded by nervous soldiers with rifles at the ready, as if to sell her, to sell the idea of her. Someone who required such precautions must be dangerous indeed. No one can deny the terrible inequality, she cried. No one can deny the racism and exploitation that keep millions in poverty. This country was founded on violence, built on violence. Just shut up already, someone called out. There was low laughter, a ripple in the crowd. Why were there guns in the house, Leo? another voice called. Leo, are you the girlfriend of Agustin Dueñas? Leo, do you work for the CIA? Are you a terrorist, Leo? At this, she pulled up, blinking. The room took a breath. Leonora, are you a terrorist? The present work is, among other things, an attempt to answer that question. Was she or was she not a terrorist? Did Leonora Gelb, in the prosecutor's words, knowingly aid, collaborate with, and provide material support to the Quarta Filosofia in their plans for violent overthrow of the government? Was she ready to take hostages, to plant bombs? Was she willing to kill or to die? In these pages, I've tried to sort through the evidence, to determine what she wanted, what she might have felt. I've tried to keep my own feelings out of it. I've tried to consider all sides. But it's been more than a decade. The words terror, freedom, democracy, war don't mean the same things anymore. Leo, the reporters shouted, answer the question. A man stood on a chair and yelled, fuck you, Leo, and fuck the Quarta Filosofia. Just as it seemed there would be no answer, the prisoner cleared her throat. Is it terrorism to love freedom, she said? Is it terrorism to hate injustice, to feed people who are hungry? She lifted her broken arm as far as she could, the hand white and clammy, clenched with the effort. There are no terrorists in the Quarta Filosofia. It's a revolutionary movement fighting to improve the lives of people who've been forgotten. She craned her neck, voice cracking. If it's terrorism to help poor mothers and sick children, then I am a terrorist. If it's a crime to stand for workers and the oppressed, I accept whatever punishment I'm given. And there it was, the red meat, the money shot. Every newspaper in Peru ran the photo the next morning, the hysterical savage, the white girl brandishing her fist, and the identical headline, Yo soy terrorista. It was a disaster, a kind of suicide. Her captors could not believe their ears. 5 days later, she was sentenced to life in prison for treason and leadership of a terrorist group. The prosecutor stood before the judges in their canvas hoods and shrugged the matter out of his hands. Senores, he said, the prisoner has already confessed.
Thank you very much. That's a really good scene.
Thank you.
And, you know, I was wondering that we talked to Russell Banks a couple episodes ago about his novel, The Darling, which has a character, Hannah Musgrave, who's also somewhat like, her motives often are good, but she's compromised in some ways and maybe not totally self-aware about what is driving her to have her good emotions, you know, motives, right? Which sort of, I think, is what's happening with your character. You mentioned, however, in the previous answer, the importance of the Peruvians in the book, right? So I wondered if you could just talk to us about, is Leonora right about the things she's saying about the government? And talk to us about those Peruvian characters who accompany us through that narrative.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I really set out to investigate in the book is exactly this question of right or wrong. I mean, does Peru have a long history of oligarchy, of oppression of linguistic minorities, ethnic minorities? Absolutely. Does it have truly unconscionable levels of income inequality? Absolutely. In 1992, when the dirty war against the Shining Path concluded, the average lifespan in the provinces, the country outside of the capital of Lima, was 45 years. Something like a third of babies died before their first birthday. So we were talking about, you know, I don't even think feudal is a strong enough word. We were talking about really kind of medieval conditions that the wealthy and the aristocracy in Lima had kept much of the country in for centuries. So for Leonora to diagnose these problems is not difficult, it's not inaccurate. The problem is when someone from outside comes in talking about what your country needs and what is better for the country, and trying to stir up change in a country that she doesn't know well, doesn't understand particularly well. You know, the entire history of American intervention in the rest of the world, particularly in the global South, is one of good intentions. It's one of saying, you know, we know what's better for your economy, for your military, for your civil society, and we're going to come in and we're going to help you.
I would put quotes around the good intentions there for most of everything that Reagan did, at least.
Well, of course. I mean, the quotes are implied because those good intentions almost always lead to slaughter, right? They almost always lead to thousands of people being impoverished, thousands of people dying. And this is why, Americans, particularly its government and its military, are so suspected around the world.
I am glad that you brought up Hannah Musgrave and The Darling, because also, I mean, as I was reading this book, inevitably, I wrote my J school thesis on literature of the Weather Underground, which was really The Darling was one of the books I wrote about. And so I had this sort of moment when I read all of these characters who were versions of allies that the people behind movements did not actually want. And Leonora Gelb is such an interesting addition to this sequence of characters. And I almost hadn't really thought of that as a category of book before, sort of the unwanted, self-righteous ally. And I also was thinking as I read about this essay that I've been obsessed with for years because I just think it's fascinating. It was in Gringa, and it was by the brilliant Pakistani-British fiction writer Kamila Shamsi, who wrote this essay called "The Storytellers of Empire," criticizing American writers of literary fiction for not engaging with just exactly what you're saying, the history and legacy of American imperialism overseas. And I think that your book is, one of the beginnings to what I hope will be a string of replies to the challenge that she issued. But her piece came out about a decade ago. I think it was originally a speech at Yale that she gave.
That's right.
So I'm curious about, what you think about that critique.
I remember that essay, Sugi, and I think it was spot on. And I wish I could say that a lot had changed since it was written, but I really don't. A few years ago, Alexander Heyman had a similar essay. I think it was in LitHub, where he was really calling out American writers for their complete lack of interest in the perspectives from other countries. And I agreed with him entirely. I think it's not just the writers, but it's also the publishing industry that has been completely uninterested in these stories. I think, there are some bright spots. I think writers of color now are writing some of these stories about America and American culture, and they are finally starting to get published in somewhat higher numbers. We need a lot more of them, but it's sort of less surprising to see a book that takes a really sharp political stance from a writer of color than from a white writer. To bring up another example, to get back to an earlier part of the discussion, you said you wrote your thesis about literature of the Weather Underground, so I'm sure you have opinions about Philip Roth's novel, An American Pastoral. I guess we're going back about 20 years now, but so this is a novel about an upper middle class white entrepreneur in New Jersey whose daughter joins something that looks like the Weather Underground, blows up a post office, and goes underground. But the novel is almost entirely about the father and his emotional suffering in the wake of what his daughter has done and his total inability to understand why she would do such a thing. And the novel takes absolutely no interest whatsoever in the political environment that gave rise to SDS and to the Weather Underground and led to some of the violence of the early 70s. So again, I wanted to write a novel that was not focused on the sensitivities and emotional suffering of Americans. And so in the Gringa, Leo is surrounded by a group of Peruvians who all have different connections to what I've called the Cuarta Filosofia, which is a stand-in for the Tupac Amaru movement. One of them lost a brother during the Dirty War, a man known to readers as Comrade Julian. His older brother was killed by government forces during the war for being involved with something that looked like the Tupac Amaru movement. On the other hand, there's a woman living in the house with her name, Comrade Marta, who it eventuates that she had actually fought with the Shining Path, though she had come to some disillusionment about the sort of wanton violence that they advocated and wanted to join a more disciplined, more reform-minded revolutionary group. And then the third person living in the house with her is a young man from the provinces named Chasqui. He has an indigenous background. His first language is Quechua. And he is someone whose perspective on violence against the state is really kind of bellwether, I think, for what's happening in the novel and where I want the reader's sort of moral imagination to fall. He comes from that angry place of saying, you know, what have they done to people like me for centuries? But he also has plenty of opportunity to see the real damage that the uncontrolled revolutionary violence can do as well. And he eventually walks away from the group to try to pursue things along more peaceful means.
And we're so glad that this book is out, finding an audience. And we're super glad that we thank, is it Melville House? Are they the publisher?
Melville House, yeah.
So good for them. They're a fantastic house. And we would encourage our listeners to go out and pick up the Gringa.
Thanks so much, Whitney.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's really great to have you on the show. And I want to just echo Whitney's recommendation, the Gringa, available now at an independent bookstore near you, and great pandemic reading.
Great to talk to you both.